Caroline Graves had packed her entire future into a single trunk, and the moment the stagecoach lurched westward out of Cincinnati on a gray March morning in 1872, she told herself that comfort was waiting for her at the end of the road. The advertisement had been specific enough. A prosperous rancher in the New Mexico territory, a man of established means and good standing, seeking a wife of sound character and industrious disposition. The broker in Cincinnati, a Mr. Harold Finch who smelled of camphor and false promises, had described the arrangement with the enthusiasm of a man selling fine horses. The rancher, one Gerald Whitmore, was said to own 300 acres of productive land with a proper house, livestock, and a housekeeper. Caroline had read the letter Gerald Whitmore had written 3 times, each reading softening the hard edge of desperation that had driven her to respond to such an advertisement in the first place. Her father had died of fever in November. Her mother had followed in January, as if she simply could not imagine the world without him. And Caroline, 26 years old with steady brown eyes and capable hands that had cooked and cleaned, and mended her way through 6 years of caring for 2 ailing parents, found herself standing in the cold hollow of a house with no income and no prospects, and a landlord who was already asking questions about the next month's rent. She was not a fool. She understood the mathematics of her situation with a clarity that some might have called cold-blooded, though Caroline preferred to think of it as practical. She was educated, having completed 2 years at the Cincinnati Female Seminary before her father's first illness had called her home. She was not without beauty, though she had long stopped thinking about that particular currency the way other young women seemed to. She had good teeth, strong arms, and enough common sense to fill a wheelbarrow. But common sense, she had discovered, did not pay rent. And so she had answered Gerald Whitmore's advertisement, and she had written him a letter that was honest about her circumstances and her character, and he had written back with an enthusiasm that she chose to interpret as genuine. The stagecoach from Cincinnati, 2 cents. Louis took 4 days, which were miserable in the way that all long journeys are miserable when you are sitting between a merchant who sweats through his collar and a minister's wife, who does not approve of women traveling alone. From St. Louis, she boarded the train heading southwest, which carried her as far as it was going in the direction of the New Mexico territory. The tracks in 1872 did not yet reach where she was going, and so there was another stagecoach, and then another, and by the time Caroline Graves climbed down on the main street of a small settlement called Redemption, New Mexico, on the 23rd day of March, she was dusty in places she had not known dust could reach, and her trunk had developed a worrying crack along one side that she tried not to look at too directly. Redemption was the kind of town that looked like it was still deciding whether or not to exist. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a small church whose white paint had given up somewhere around 1868, and a collection of buildings scattered along a single wide street of packed red earth. The mountains in the distance were extraordinary, great purple and red formations against a sky so blue it looked manufactured, and the air tasted of sage and something dry and mineral that she had no name for. She breathed it in and tried to decide if she found it beautiful or terrifying. She landed, after a moment's consideration, on both. She had been told that Gerald Whitmore would meet her at the stage stop. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stage office for 20 minutes, watching the other passengers disperse, watching the stagecoach driver unhitch his horses with the efficiency of a man who had performed the same task 10,000 times. Nobody came to greet her. Inside the stage office, a young man with a sunburned neck told her that Gerald Whitmore had sent word that he would be delayed by a day, possibly 2, and that she should take a room at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Alma Pierce 2 streets over. Caroline thanked him, picked up her cracked trunk, refused his offer of help with a polite firmness that surprised even herself, and went to find Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Alma Pierce was a woman in her mid-50s who had the kind of face that had once been very pretty and had settled, through years of sun and hard work, and possibly a significant amount of laughter, into something much more interesting. She gave Caroline a room with a real window, a proper wash basin, and a quilt that smelled of lavender, and she asked no questions beyond those strictly necessary, which Caroline found so deeply refreshing that she almost wept at the supper table. Gerald Whitmore arrived on the morning of the third day. Caroline had spent those 2 days walking the streets of Redemption with her notebook, writing down observations in the way she always did when she needed to think. The town was rough but not lawless, held together by the particular social gravity that small, isolated communities develop. There was a marshal named Pete Granger, a slow-moving man of impressive mustache, who made one circuit of the main street every morning and every evening. There was a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the dentist, a school teacher who looked about 19 and frightened of everything. There were ranching families who came in on Saturdays for supplies, and there were cowboys drifting through on their way to and from the larger cattle drives further north. She watched it all and wrote it down and waited. When Gerald Whitmore finally appeared at Mrs. Pierce's front door on that third morning, Caroline understood within approximately 4 minutes of his arrival that the advertisement had been, at the very least, generously interpreted. He was a man of about 50, which she had expected. The letter had suggested he was in his early 50s, and she had made her peace with the age gap before she had ever boarded a stagecoach. But Gerald Whitmore in person bore so little resemblance to Gerald Whitmore on paper that she found herself looking past him to see if there was someone else behind him. He was slovenly in a way that went beyond the honest dirt of hard work. His hands were soft. His eyes moved around the room in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of Mr. Harold Finch back in Cincinnati. He spoke about his ranch with expansive gestures that contained no specific details, and when she asked him direct questions about the land, the livestock, the house, he answered with other questions or with a laugh that went on slightly too long. She asked about the housekeeper mentioned in his letter. He said the woman had left in February. She asked why. He said women were difficult to keep in this country. She asked whether the house had a proper kitchen. He said it had everything a woman could want. She asked him to describe it. He described with growing impatience a stove and a table and, he thought, a window above the sink. She asked how many cattle he kept. He said a good number. She asked for the number. He said figures weren't really the sort of thing to discuss over tea. She looked at him very carefully for a long moment. Gerald Whitmore looked back at her with an expression that had begun as confidence and was quietly becoming something less comfortable. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, with a courtesy she had to work for, "I have traveled 23 days to be here. I have left everything I knew behind me. I would very much like, before we proceed any further, to see this ranch for myself." He agreed, after some waffling, to take her out to the property the following day. That evening, Caroline sat in her room at Mrs. Pierce's and wrote in her notebook for a long time. When she finally put the pencil down, she had not arrived at any comfortable conclusions, but she had organized her thoughts into something she could work with, and that was as much as she had ever been able to ask of her notebook. The ride to the Whitmore property the next morning took the better part of 2 hours in a wagon that badly needed new axle grease, driven by Gerald Whitmore with a kind of distracted inattention that made her grip the seat with one hand without letting him see her do it. The country they crossed was rugged and breathtaking, great stretches of red earth and juniper, and the occasional cottonwood bright with its first spring leaves along a dry creek bed. She would have enjoyed it under other circumstances. The ranch, when it appeared, was not what had been described. There was a house, which was accurate in that it was a structure with walls and a roof. But the walls needed daubing, and the roof had a sag on the east side that suggested significant structural doubt. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about Gerald Whitmore's priorities. The corrals held perhaps 40 head of cattle, not the 300 acres of productive working operation that the advertisement had implied. The land itself was fine land. She could see that. but it was being asked very little of. Two ranch hands were visible, young men who touched their hat brims and looked at their boots when Gerald introduced her, and whose expressions carried the specific uncomfortable look of men who knew more than they were saying. She asked to see the kitchen. The kitchen was functional in the way that a room with a cold stove, 6 months of uncleaned residue on every surface, and a single pot of indeterminate age sitting in the dry sink could be described as functional. The window Gerald had mentioned did exist. It had no glass. She stood in the middle of that kitchen and breathed for a moment. She was not a woman given to self-pity, but she allowed herself, in the privacy of that kitchen with Gerald outside talking loudly to his hands about nothing in particular, approximately 30 seconds of recognizing how badly she had miscalculated. She had left Cincinnati for comfort. She had traveled 23 days and spent nearly everything she had saved, and what she had found was not comfort but a larger and more complicated version of the same struggle she had been trying to escape, attached to a man she did not trust and could not respect. Then the 30 seconds were over, and she was practical again, because that was the only thing she had ever known how to be. She told Gerald Whitmore, on the ride back to Redemption, that she needed several more days to think things over. He was not pleased, but he also was not in a position to argue since she had made him no promises beyond her arrival. She returned to Mrs. Pierce's and she sat down and she thought, with the methodical thoroughness of someone taking stock of a difficult inventory, about what her actual options were. She could marry Gerald Whitmore and manage the ranch herself, which the physical evidence strongly suggested was the only way it would function at all. This meant, in practical terms, cleaning that kitchen and redaubing those walls and figuring out the roof and turning 40 head of cattle into something like a proper operation, all while being married to a man she could not bring herself to like. She could write back to Cincinnati and ask for help, but there was no one left to write to. She could try to find work in Redemption, but employment options for a single woman of no local connection were limited. She could use her last remaining funds to take the stage back east and start over somewhere, which was the most frightening option because it meant beginning from absolute zero. She was sitting with this inventory in Mrs. Pierce's front parlor on the morning of her 4th day in Redemption, her notebook open and untouched in her lap, when she heard the most extraordinary argument happening in the street outside. She went to the window because she was human. The argument was between a man she recognized as Dawson, the owner of the general store, and a man she had not seen before. The stranger was taller than Dawson by a significant measure, with the kind of lean, work-made frame that the West seemed to produce in men the way good soil produces corn. He had dark hair under a worn hat, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone as the cliffs, and he was speaking with a quiet, controlled forcefulness that was somehow more compelling than shouting. Dawson, who was shouting, seemed to be coming off the worse for it. The argument appeared to concern a supply order of some kind, a dispute over what had been delivered versus what had been promised, and the stranger was laying out his case with a precision and patience that was remarkable for a man who was clearly also angry. He won the argument without raising his voice above a certain register, accepted Dawson's grudging concession with a brief nod, loaded a bag of something into the bed of his wagon, and drove away down the street. Caroline sat back down. "Who was that?" she asked Mrs. Pierce when the older woman brought the morning coffee. "Emmett Donovan, Mrs. Pierce said, with the particular inflection of someone giving information that comes attached to a context. "He runs the Double D Ranch about 15 miles east of town. Good outfit. Started it from nothing about 7 years ago after he came back from the war." She set the coffee down and looked at Caroline with the mild, observant eyes of a woman who had been watching people for a very long time. "He's been short-handed for the spring work. Lost 2 of his men to the Silver Strike up near Silver City. He's been coming in looking for extra hands for 3 weeks. Does he find them?" Caroline asked, because she was curious, and because the observation about being short-handed had landed somewhere useful in her practical mind. "Not of the quality he's looking for," Mrs. Pierce said, and then went back to her kitchen. Caroline thought about this. She thought about it all through the morning. She thought about it while she wrote a careful, honest, and somewhat painful letter to Gerald Whitmore, explaining that she had decided the arrangement would not suit either of them, and that she hoped he would find a wife better suited to his situation. She sealed that letter and left it with the stage office for delivery, and stood on the boardwalk outside with her hands in her pockets and the warm New Mexico morning sun on her face, and the full, clean, terrifying weight of having no plan. Then she walked to the livery stable and asked the man there, a Mexican-American gentleman named Santos, who was very comfortable to talk to, how one would go about finding the Double D Ranch 15 miles east of town. Santos looked at her for a moment with the look of a man doing quiet arithmetic about her situation. Then he gave her very precise directions. She did not go immediately. She went back to Mrs. Pierce's and ate lunch and thought some more and concluded that her thinking had reached its limit, and that action was now the only productive option. Then she asked Santos if she could hire a horse for the afternoon. She found the Double D Ranch at the end of a track that curved up through a landscape of juniper and pinon pine and opened suddenly onto a valley that made her stop the horse without meaning to. It was a proper valley, wide and green with spring grass along the creek that ran through its center, the mountains rising on three sides in that extraordinary red and purple the New Mexico light seemed to pull out of the stone. The ranch buildings were set at the north end of the valley, and even from a distance she could see that they were well maintained, the barn large and solid, the corrals well built, the main house a substantial structure with a covered porch running along its front face. There were working sounds coming from the corrals. Men and horses, the creak of leather, the particular patient sounds of cattle being handled by people who knew what they were doing. She rode in through the gate. Emmett Donovan was in the near corral working with a young horse, a blood bay colt who was still deciding how he felt about having a saddle on his back. Emmett was working the colt on a long line, moving with the horse in a wide circle, his attention entirely focused on the animal. He had not heard her come in. She stopped her borrowed horse at the corral fence and watched for a moment, because watching someone do something with real skill is its own kind of pleasure, and Emmett Donovan was very skilled. When the colt finally settled and blew out a long breath and dropped his head, Emmett let him stand and rest, and only then did he turn to the fence. He looked at her without surprise, which suggested he had peripheral vision or ranch instincts or possibly both. His eyes were a dark hazel, and they assessed her with the same quiet precision she had watched him use on Dawson's supply argument that morning. She had the feeling of being correctly understood rather than merely looked at. "Help you," he said. His voice was low and carried well. The single scar along his left jaw was thin and old, something earned a long time ago. "My name is Caroline Graves," she said. She had decided that directness was the only sensible approach. "I arrived in Redemption 5 days ago." "I was told you're looking for help for the spring work." He was quiet for a moment. I'm looking for employment," she said. "I can cook, keep accounts, manage a household, mend equipment, ride adequately, and I learn everything else quickly. I'm told you've had difficulty finding people of suitable quality." He studied her from beneath the brim of his hat. "You're not from here." "Cincinnati," she said. "I came west to take up a marital arrangement that turned out to be misrepresented. I have no intention of going back east, and I have enough money remaining to stay in Redemption approximately 4 weeks before my situation becomes serious. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." He was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable exactly, but that had a weight to it. "What kind of work?" "Whatever you need done that I'm capable of doing," she said. "I understand that's an unusual answer. I'm trying to be accurate rather than strategic." Something shifted in his expression, something small and not entirely readable. He took off his hat and ran his hand through his dark hair and looked across the valley for a moment as if thinking about something completely separate from her, though she was fairly certain he was not. "My cook left in January," he said. "My accounts are a month behind. My house looks like nobody lives in it, which is approximately accurate. I've got spring branding starting in 2 weeks, and I need someone managing the household while my men are working cattle." "I can do all of that," she said. "You'd have your own room in the house," he said. "Private with a lock, that's not negotiable. I pay fair wages, same as any of my hands. You'd be an employee, not a servant. And if you find something better or decide this isn't what you want, you tell me and I don't make it difficult." She was surprised, and she let him see that she was surprised, because she thought pretending otherwise would be the wrong beginning. "That's more straightforward than I expected," she said. "I don't have time for anything else," he said. It did not sound like a dismissal, it sounded like a fact. He put his hat back on. "When can you start?" "Would Monday suit?" she said. "I have a few things to settle in town." "Monday suits," he said. She thanked him and turned her borrowed horse toward the gate. She had ridden about 20 yards back down the track when his voice reached her, not raised but carrying perfectly in the clear air. "Miss Graves, what did Whitmore misrepresent?" She turned the horse. He was standing at the corral fence, one boot on the lowest rail, watching her. "Everything that mattered," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, and turned back to his colt. She rode back to Redemption with the sage-scented wind in her face and the mountains going pink at their edges in the late afternoon light, and she felt, for the first time in a very long while, that she was moving toward something rather than away from something. It was a different sensation entirely, and she sat with it carefully, not wanting to break it. Monday came with a sky clear as glass and the smell of rain that had fallen somewhere during the night over the mountains. Caroline loaded her cracked trunk into the bed of the wagon Santos lent her for the morning, thanked Mrs. Pierce with a genuine warmth that surprised them both into a brief embrace, and drove the 15 miles east feeling more awake than she had since Cincinnati. The Double D in working mode was a different creature from the quiet corral scene she had witnessed on Friday. There were 4 ranch hands in residence, young men ranging from 17 to 25, who regarded her arrival with a variety of expressions spanning curiosity, relief, and something that might have been hope in the direction of proper meals. Emmett introduced them. Walt, who was the oldest and served as trail boss. Lewis, who was Santos's nephew and the best rider on the crew according to everyone including Lewis. Billy, who was 17 and had the specific quality of uselessness that 17 sometimes produces, and the equal and opposite potential to become excellent that 17 also sometimes produces. And a quiet man called Morgan who spoke in short sentences and could apparently shoe a horse faster than anyone in 2 counties. The house itself was, as Emmett had said, approximately unoccupied in feel, though it was structurally sound and spacious. It had a large kitchen with a good iron stove, which she assessed within her first 10 minutes with the focused attention of someone who understood that kitchens are the organizing center of working households. There were windows with actual glass. There was a pantry that was depressingly sparse. There was a main room with a stone fireplace that had not been properly cleaned in what appeared to be several months. There was a dining table large enough for 8 people. There were 4 bedrooms and a small office off the main room where a desk was buried under papers in a condition that explained why the accounts were a month behind. Her room was at the north end of the hall. It had a window overlooking the valley and a bed with a good frame and a hook on the back of the door for a lock that, she checked, actually functioned. She set her trunk at the foot of the bed, changed into her plainest dress, and went to the kitchen. She spent the first day doing inventory. She wrote down what was in the pantry, what was in the barn, what equipment existed, and what was broken or missing. She noted the water situation, the wood supply, the condition of the stove, the state of the fireplace. She found a root cellar she hadn't been told about that contained a useful store of preserved vegetables. She found, in a cupboard in the kitchen, a good set of cast iron pots that had been neglected but not ruined, and she spent an hour that evening cleaning and reseasoning 2 of them. At supper, she served the men a simple bean and salt pork dish with cornbread, because it was what she could manage reliably on the first night in an unfamiliar stove, and the quality of the silence around the table after the first bites told her everything she needed to know about how they had been eating before her arrival. Emmett sat at the head of the table and ate without speaking, which she would come to understand was his default mode at meals, not unfriendly but self-contained, comfortable with quiet in the way that men who spend long hours alone in large landscapes often are. When he finished, he said, plainly and without embellishment, that it was a good supper. It was the first purely positive review she had received from anyone in almost a year, and she accepted it with a nod and went to clean up. The days established themselves into a rhythm with a speed that surprised her. She rose at 5, had coffee and cornmeal mush ready when the men came in from their first chores at 6, sent them out with packed lunches when the work was far afield, and began the serious cooking for the evening meal by mid-afternoon. In between she cleaned, which was a significant undertaking in the first 2 weeks, and she ordered supplies from town through Lewis, who made a weekly run, and she went through the account books in the office with a methodical patience that she found herself actually enjoying, because whatever else the ledgers revealed, they also revealed that the Double D was a fundamentally sound operation being run by someone who knew what he was doing. Emmett Donovan had come to the New Mexico Territory in 1865 after the war, 22 years old and apparently determined to make something from nothing in the way that certain men who have survived terrible things sometimes are. He had acquired the land cheaply, through a combination of luck and timing, and a tolerance for hard labor that the ledgers documented in a 7-year column of increasing stability. He ran 320 head of cattle now, with another 80 head of horses, and he sold to the beef markets in Santa Fe, and had a contract with the Army post at Fort Union for breeding stock. She learned this partly from the ledgers and partly from Walt, who talked as steadily and unstoppably as a creek in spring, and very little of it from Emmett himself, who answered direct questions with direct answers but volunteered nothing. What he did do, she noticed, was pay attention. She noticed this first in small ways. She had mentioned once, in passing, at the supper table that the East Corral fence nearest the barn had a section that was sagging and would need to be repaired before branding because cattle under stress would find it. 2 days later the fence was repaired. She had not asked him to do it. He had simply heard her, processed the information, and acted on it. She had mentioned that the coffee grinding was going to exhaust her rotation of tasks if the grinder continued to stick, and the next morning the grinder had been cleaned and oiled and worked smoothly. He was not demonstrative. He was not effusive, but she began to understand that his attention was its own kind of language, thorough and consistent and reliable in a way that people who expressed themselves through words and gestures sometimes were not. The branding started on the 2nd week of April, which was earlier than she had expected but which Emmett explained was a function of the calves being ready, weather being right, and him having borrowed 2 extra hands from a neighboring ranch called the Rafter M, whose owner, a woman named Agnes Whitfield, who was somewhere in her mid-60s, and ran her place with an iron composure that Caroline found inspiring, had agreed to an exchange of labor. Branding week was the hardest work Caroline had encountered since her worst years nursing her parents, and that said something. She was cooking for 9 people 3 times a day, feeding men who were working from dawn until the light failed, and who came in each evening smelling of wood smoke and burned hair, and containing about the caloric deficit of a full-grown bear at the end of winter. She baked bread every morning. She made large pots of stew. She made biscuits in quantities that seemed improbable. She made coffee constantly. She found, somewhere deep in the pantry, a tin of cinnamon and a bag of dried apples, and she made a dried apple cake on the third evening that caused a silence around the table of a quality she had previously only associated with religious experience. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Emmett asked her that evening. It was the first personal question he had asked her. She was washing up. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway in the way he sometimes did, having come back for a second cup of coffee, which she had already learned was as close as he came to lingering. "From my mother," she said, "and then from necessity. My parents were ill for a long time before they died. I cooked to keep us all going." He was quiet for a moment. "Both gone." "In the fall and winter just past," she said. "Yes." He looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. She turned back to the washing up. "What about yours?" "My father died when I was 12, he said. "Mother when I was 16. There were no other family members worth counting." He said it the way he said most things, with a plainness that was not unfeeling but that had been stripped of any expectation of particular sympathy. "So you've been on your own a long time," she said. "It teaches you certain things," he said. "What things?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "How to rely on your own judgment," he said. "How to read situations accurately and not let wishful thinking cloud what you're seeing." He paused. "How to be very selective about what you trust." She turned to look at him properly. He was watching her with an expression she was still learning the vocabulary of, something careful and evaluating and not unfriendly. "That's an honest answer," she said. "You seem to prefer them," he said. Then he picked up his coffee cup and went back to the main room, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with the warm dishwater going slowly cool around her hands, and something quiet and careful turning over in the center of her chest. The branding was finished by the end of the second week of April. Agnes Whitfield came out personally to retrieve her two borrowed hands and to inspect the results of the branding, and she and Emmett had a conversation at the corral fence that Caroline watched from the kitchen window, Agnes pointing at the new calves and Emmett nodding, and occasionally gesturing toward the far pasture. Agnes Whitfield was the kind of woman who had been shaped by the West into something as hard and useful as good steel, and Caroline felt a complicated admiration for her that included a recognition of what years of that kind of life cost. Agnes came into the kitchen before she left to ask for the dried apple cake recipe, which she delivered as a demand with the air of someone accustomed to getting what they asked for. Caroline gave it to her without hesitation, and Agnes gave it one brief look and put it in her coat pocket and said, with no particular preface, "You're doing good work here." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Caroline said. "Are you staying?" Agnes said. It was an interesting question because it had several layers to it, and Agnes Whitfield clearly knew this. Caroline thought about it for a moment. "I think so," she said. "Good," Agnes said, and went back to her horses. May arrived and the ranch settled into its summer rhythm, which was not slower exactly, but differently paced than the branding season. The cattle were in the summer pastures. The horses were being worked and the young ones brought along. Emmett spent long days in the saddle with his men and came in each evening with the specific quality of tiredness that comes from good physical work well done. Caroline had by now conquered the kitchen thoroughly enough that it ran largely on its own schedule, and she found herself with afternoons that had some flex in them. She had reorganized the account books completely, which Emmett had discovered one morning in early May when he went to the office for something, and stood in the doorway for a long moment taking in the ordered state of the desk before going to find her in the kitchen. "You reorganized the accounts," he said. "I hope that was all right," she said. "They needed it. I've also flagged 3 entries from last November that I believe contain arithmetic errors. And I think your contract with Fort Union can be renegotiated when it comes up in September. You're undervaluing your breeding stock based on the current market rates I found in the copies of the Santa Fe paper you keep in the barn for some reason." He stared at her for a moment. "The Santa Fe paper? In a box under the workbench. There are 8 months of issues. I read them when I was organizing the pantry." "You read 8 months of the Santa Fe New Mexican?" "I like to be informed," she said. "Would you like to see what I found about the breeding stock prices?" He came to the table and sat across from her while she spread out the papers she had organized. And for the next hour they went through the contract and the ledgers together with an attention and fluency that felt, to Caroline, less like a meeting between an employer and a housekeeper, and more like a partnership of particular efficiency. Emmett asked good questions. He saw things she had missed, and she saw things he had missed. And by the end of the hour there was a plan for the Fort Union renegotiation that was better than either of them would have arrived at alone. When they finished and she began gathering up the papers, he looked at her with that particular steady regard that she had by now become somewhat too accustomed to noticing. "Where did you learn accounting?" he said. "The Cincinnati Female Seminary," she said. 2 years. They were liberal in their curriculum. And then I kept my father's business accounts from the time I was 18. He had a dry goods store until he became too ill to maintain it. "You could have been a bookkeeper," he said. "Women in Cincinnati are not generally employed as bookkeepers," she said, "especially not unattached women with sick parents." He was quiet for a moment. "That's unjust." "Yes," she said, "it is." She was surprised that he said it. Most men she had encountered in her life simply accepted the structure of things as natural rather than chosen. "The West is different," he said. "Not always fairly different and not always in the right ways. But Agnes Whitfield runs a 500-acre ranch, and she's considered a serious businesswoman by everyone who matters in this territory." "I noticed that," Caroline said. "It's one of the reasons I'm not on a stagecoach back to Ohio." He smiled at that. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, not the brief, controlled expressions he sometimes permitted at supper, but an actual smile that changed the whole architecture of his face. She found it considerably more disabling than she had been prepared for and had to look down at her papers for a moment. "I should get back," he said, standing. "Yes," she said, "of course." He was at the office door when he paused. "Miss Graves." "Yes. Thank you for the accounts and the Santa Fe paper." "Any time," she said, with a steadiness she was proud of. He went and she sat at the table for a moment with her hands flat on the papers and a warmth in her chest that she decided, firmly and practically, not to examine too closely. She was an employee. He was her employer. She was 26 years old and in a new country, and had made enough miscalculations in the last year to last her a lifetime. She went back to the kitchen. She had been at the Double D for 6 weeks when the incident with the Rafter M cattle happened. She had ridden out to check on a calf she had noticed 3 days earlier that was showing signs of something troubling, a calf that was in the east pasture nearest the mountains, which was a longer ride than she usually attempted alone. She had asked Lewis to come with her, but he had been sent to town and she had gone anyway, because waiting had seemed inefficient. She found the calf and it was fine, which was a relief. On her way back she came across a section of fence along the eastern boundary that was down, with what appeared to be Rafter M cattle on the Double D side of the line. She did a quick count. 7 head. She could see where they had come from, and she could see that the fence had not fallen on its own but had been pulled down, 2 posts knocked clean over in a way that wind and age did not produce. She sat her horse and looked at this for a long moment, then turned and rode hard back to the main buildings. Emmett was at the barn when she rode in. He saw her face and his own face changed immediately. "What happened?" she told him quickly and accurately. He listened without interrupting and then called Walt over and they had a brief, quiet conversation that she partly heard, and then Emmett saddled his horse and looked at her. "You're sure it was pulled down?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "The posts were knocked inward from the Rafter M side." His jaw was tight. "There's a family over there, 2 brothers, who have been pushing the boundary lines for 2 years. Agnes knows about it and she's been trying to manage it. This is the 3rd time the fence has gone down in that section." He checked his cinch. "I need to go have a look and get those cattle back. You should go inside." "I'm not injured," she said. "I can show you exactly where it is faster than describing it." He looked at her for a moment. "Can you manage a rifle if you needed to?" "My father taught me," she said. "I haven't fired one in 3 years, but I remember the mechanics." He went to the barn and came back with a Winchester and handed it to her without ceremony, and they rode out together with Walt and Morgan following, and she led them directly to the downed fence. The two brothers, whose names were Cade and Reuben Farrow, were on their own side of the line when they arrived, watching the situation with the air of men prepared to deny everything. They were rough-looking, in their 30s, and Cade Farrow had the specific expression of a man who had never encountered a consequence he couldn't talk his way out of. Emmett said very little. He said, with a precision that suggested considerable self-control, that the fence would be repaired today and the cattle would be returned today, and that if this boundary line was interfered with one more time, he would involve Marshal Granger and the Territorial Land Office, both of which he was prepared to do immediately and without further negotiation. He said it quietly and clearly, and something in the way he said it convinced Cade Farrow, who began with bluster and ended with silence, that this was not a man who made statements he was not prepared to back. They rode back with the Rafter M cattle pushed ahead of them and Walt and Morgan setting the posts back. Caroline rode beside Emmett, and he rode with the tension still in him, in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw, and she thought about what it must cost a man to build something carefully over years in a landscape that offered no guarantees, and then have to defend it repeatedly from people who respected only boundaries they were forced to respect. "Does it wear on you?" she said after a while. He looked at her sideways. "What? Having to be so constantly watchful, defending everything you've built?" He was quiet for a moment. The mountains were doing something extraordinary with the late afternoon light, going gold and rose and deep red in the way that still stopped her breath even after 6 weeks of it. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than it used to." He was quiet again. "When I first came here, every problem felt like it might be the one that finished the whole enterprise. I spent 2 years in a state of continuous alarm." He glanced at her. "I don't know exactly when it changed, but it changed." "Confidence," she said. "Not exactly," he said. "More like trust, in the land, in the people I chose to have around me, in my own ability to handle what comes." He paused. "The war did a lot of things I wouldn't recommend, but one thing it did was teach me the difference between a situation that's genuinely dangerous and one that only feels that way." She thought about this. "I think I understand that," she said. "I spent 6 years managing everything my parents needed, and there were times when the weight of it felt impossible. But it never actually was. I handled all of it." "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." He looked at her with that particular attention again. "You're not what I expected when you rode in." "What did you expect?" "A woman in a difficult situation who needed temporary shelter while she arranged something else," he said honestly. "And instead," he looked back at the track ahead, "someone considerably more useful and considerably more interesting than that," he said. It was such a plain, unembellished compliment that it hit her like something from a height she hadn't been watching. She looked at the mountains and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would be as good as the silence. June arrived with a heat that was dry and clean, and different from anything Ohio had produced. A heat that you could feel thinking about you rather than simply pressing down on you. And the valley of the Double D was green along the creek and bleached gold further out, and the sky was enormous. She had been writing letters to the Cincinnati Female Seminary, not asking for anything but re-establishing a connection, sending along some observations about accounting practices in territorial ranch operations that she had developed during her reorganization of the Double D ledgers. She had done this partly from old habit, and partly because she thought it was important to keep her mind engaged in the widest possible sense. She had received, in return, an interested letter from one of her former teachers asking if she might be willing to correspond regularly about practical financial management, as they were developing a new curriculum component. She told Emmett about this at supper one evening because it had made her genuinely pleased, and she found that she had stopped calculating whether or not to share things with him and had started simply doing it. "They want you to contribute to a curriculum," he said. Informally, she said, through letters. It's not a paid position or anything formal, but it's something. You should do it, he said. I am doing it, she said. He smiled. Of course you are. And then more quietly, you don't really need my encouragement. No, she said, but I like it anyway. There was a quality to the silence after that which she noted and set carefully aside. Walt had been watching this exchange with the particular expression of a man who has been around the situation long enough to have an opinion, but who knows better than to say it. Lewis was looking at the ceiling. Billy was eating with the focused energy of someone who had not caught up to the subtext yet. Morgan was quiet, as Morgan always was. In the kitchen afterward, washing up, she permitted herself to think about what was actually happening. She liked Emmett Donovan. This was the simple fact of the matter. She liked him in the specific, detailed way that you like something that has proven itself over time, and through evidence rather than in the first impression way of feeling that can evaporate under closer examination. She liked his honesty and his precision, and his way of listening that was full rather than performed. She liked that he had built something real from nothing, and had done it without becoming hard or closed. She liked that he had repaired the corral fence without being asked. She liked his voice in the kitchen doorway asking for a second cup of coffee. She liked the way he looked at the mountains sometimes, with a proprietary love that was also reverent, as if he still could not quite believe they were his to look at. And she was an employee on a ranch in New Mexico territory, 23 days' ride from everything she had ever known, and she had already made one significant miscalculation about a man in this territory, and she was not in any hurry to make another. She was, however, not unaware of the way he looked at her. It was not unsubtle, which in some ways made it harder to dismiss. He was a man who had told her he was selective about what he trusted, and she understood that his attention was not something he distributed carelessly. The fact that he gave it to her consistently and fully was not an accident, and she did not pretend to herself that it was. She washed the last pot and dried her hands and went to her room and opened her notebook and wrote for a while. Her entries had changed since Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, the notebook had been full of problems to solve. Now it was full of observations, of things she saw and heard and wanted to keep. The mountains, the way the light changed over the valley through the day. A description of Agnes Whitfield at the corral fence. Billy learning, slowly and with considerable stubbornness, how to properly wrap a horse's leg. The first evening she had heard Emmett laugh, really laugh, at something Lewis had said, and the way it had filled the main room like something the room had been waiting for. July brought a water problem. The creek that ran through the valley had been running well enough, but a particularly dry spring and early summer had lowered it more than Emmett had expected, and the upper pasture where the main herd was running was getting thin at the watering spot. He was going to have to move the herd to the lower pasture earlier than planned, which would mean pressure on the grass down there before it was ideal, and there was a cost calculation that needed to be made about supplementary feed versus the risk to the pasture. He brought this to Caroline without ceremony, arriving in the office doorway one afternoon where she was working on a letter to Cincinnati and laying out the problem. She thought he had come for conversation or sympathy or to think out loud. What he had actually come for was her analysis. She sat with him at the desk for 2 hours with the ledgers and the land maps he spread out, and they calculated together what the feed costs would be if they supplemented the lower pasture against what they would lose in pasture quality if they didn't. And she asked him questions about the water table and whether there was any spring access on the northeast section that might serve as an alternative. And it turned out there was a spring on the northeast section that had not been used in 3 years because a landslide in 1869 had partially blocked the access track. "Can the track be cleared?" she said. 3 days' work, he said. 4 men. Versus 6 weeks of supplementary feed, she said, pointing to the numbers she had written out. He looked at the numbers and then at her. "You're right," he said. "I should have thought of the spring." "You've been managing the herd situation," she said. "I've been sitting with the ledgers. We see different things." "We think better together," he said, and then stopped in the way that a person stops when they have said something more than they intended. She looked at the ledger pages carefully for a moment. "We do," she said. He cleared his throat and started rolling up the land maps. "I'll get the men started on the track tomorrow. I'll pack them a good lunch," she said. He went. She sat at the desk. Outside the window, the afternoon light was making the valley look like something from a painting, all gold and green and the mountains deepening to purple. She thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it very clearly, and she sat with it for a moment to see how it felt. It felt true, which was different from convenient and different from wishful thinking, and was the thing she had been most careful about not confusing either of those things with. Then she went to start supper. The Northeast Spring track was cleared in 3 days, and the herd was managed without supplementary feed, and the pasture recovered. There was a brief thunderstorm in late July that brought 2 inches of rain over 2 days and raised the creek level considerably. And everybody on the ranch went about for those 2 days with the specific quiet pleasure of people whose problem has solved itself. On the evening of the second rain day, when the storm had passed and the valley was silver green and smelling of wet sage, Emmett came to the kitchen doorway and said that if she had wanted to see the valley from the top of the northeast ridge, this was the evening to do it. She looked at him. "Is that an invitation?" "Yes," he said. They rode up the ridge in the last hour of daylight, the horses stepping carefully on the wet ground, and at the top the whole valley was spread below them in a light that had no name she knew, gold and silver and that deep red the wet sandstone turned, and she could see the creek flashing and the cattle dark shapes in the lower pasture and the ranch buildings solid and correct at the valley's head. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. He was looking at it the way he sometimes did. "You must be proud of it," she said. "I'm grateful for it," he said. "Pride feels like it's about me. The land doesn't care about me particularly. It just is. I'm grateful I get to be part of it." She looked at him in the extraordinary light. "That's a generous way to understand your own achievement." "The land did most of it," he said. "I just paid attention." She turned back to the valley. "I think you pay attention to everything," she said. "It's the most useful thing about you, and the most dangerous." He was quiet for a moment. Why dangerous? She thought about whether to answer honestly. She had been at the Double D for 4 months, and she was very tired of being strategic. "Because it's very difficult," she said carefully, "to be genuinely seen by someone and not care about them." The silence stretched out over the valley. A nighthawk was doing its evening sweeping. The sky above the mountains was going to a deep green that would be dark in minutes. "Caroline," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed differently than she had expected, quieter and more specific than she could have prepared for. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said, "and I would rather say it plainly because anything else would be dishonest, and I think you'd rather have honesty." "I would," she said. He looked at the valley for one more moment and then looked at her. "I hired you as an employee, and I have tried to be scrupulously correct about that distinction, because I respect you and your situation, and I don't want you to feel that anything in this household was anything other than what it was supposed to be." He paused. "But I am not capable, at this point, of pretending that what I feel for you is simply employer to employee. And I think you deserve to know that, and to make whatever decision you think is right with that information, without any pressure from me." The nighthawk swept low over the ridge and away. "What exactly is it that you feel?" she said, "if you're going to be plain about it." He looked at her with the same full, unhurried attention he had always given her. "I think about you constantly," he said. "Not in a way I'm embarrassed by. In the way you think about something that has become essential. You changed this place by being in it. And I am aware that's a considerable thing to say to someone who came here because they had limited options, so I want to be clear that I'm saying it without any expectation attached." She looked at him. The dark was coming over the valley from the east, the way it always did, quietly and with great certainty. "Emmett," she said, "I have been in love with you since the argument with Dawson about the supply order." He went still. "I watched you from Mrs. Pierce's window," she said. And I thought, that man says exactly what he means and nothing extra, and he wins arguments without shouting, and the way he moves suggests he is comfortable taking up exactly the right amount of space in the world and not 1 inch more. She paused. And then I found out you needed help, and I told myself I was coming out here for practical reasons, which was technically true, but I was also deeply hoping to find that you were as decent close up as you looked from the window. And, he said, very quietly. You're better, she said. He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she let him, and they sat on the ridge in the coming dark with the valley spread below them and her hand in his, and neither of them said anything for a long while because there was nothing that needed to be said more urgently than the silence. They rode back to the ranch in the last of the light. At the barn, unsaddling the horses in companionable quiet, he said, I would like to ask you to marry me. I'm not asking tonight because you've had enough men making arrangements around you, and I don't want to be one of them. But I want you to know that's what I want, so that when I do ask, it isn't a surprise. She hung her saddle over the rail. That is, she said, the most carefully organized romantic intention I've ever heard. I'm told I'm methodical, he said. You are, she said. I find it extremely attractive, which I'm sure surprises you. He laughed that real laugh, and it filled the barn the way it had filled the main room the first time she heard it. She thought, this is what I came west for. Not comfort in the way I understood it, not ease or security arranged by someone else, but this specific thing, a person who sees you and tells you the truth about it and builds toward you the same careful way he builds everything else. August was the most beautiful month she had ever experienced in any landscape. The monsoon rains came every afternoon, building on the mountains through the morning, and rolling across the valley by 3 o'clock, dramatic and fast and gone in an hour, leaving the air clean and the sage incandescent and the creek rushing. The valley was at its greenest. The cattle were in good condition. The horses were moving between pastures with the particular arrogant ease of horses who know they are well fed and well managed. Billy had become genuinely useful, which happened somewhere in the middle of July with the abruptness that 17 sometimes produced, and it was a pleasure to witness. He had started to take real pride in his work, and Emmett had noticed this and given him additional responsibility with the young horses, which Billy had taken up with a seriousness that made him seem at least 3 years older. Lewis had a girl in town that everyone knew about and no one mentioned because that was the social compact. Morgan had revealed, slowly over time, a surprising talent for telling long, involved stories in the evenings on the porch, quiet enough the rest of the time that, when he did speak at length, it had the quality of a gift. Walt, who noticed everything and always had been watching Caroline and Emmett with the patient satisfaction of someone watching a complicated equation resolve itself toward a correct answer. He said nothing directly. But he had begun, by some social alchemy she couldn't quite trace, to arrange the supper table differently, to see to his own second cup of coffee, to take the other men elsewhere after supper in a way that left the main room available with a regularity that could not be entirely coincidental. Those evenings in the main room became important to her in a way she had not expected. Emmett read, mostly, history and land management, and the occasional novel that he chose with the specific embarrassment of a man who liked novels more than he thought he was supposed to. She wrote letters or worked on her correspondence with Cincinnati or kept her notebook. But they were together in the room, and that togetherness had a texture that she had never experienced before, a complete ease of presence that did not require performance or management. That was simply what it was. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes he read something aloud, because he thought she would find it interesting. Sometimes she asked him about the history of the territory, which he knew in considerable depth, and he told her things about the land and the people who had lived on it before and the complex, often unjust history of how the territory had been settled. including frank acknowledgments of what had been done to the Apache and Navajo peoples who had lived there long before any European-descended person arrived, which surprised her and moved her. Because most men she had encountered in her life did not speak about injustice they had not personally suffered. He spoke about it with a clear-eyed sorrow that was not self-flagellating but was honest, and she thought it was part of the same quality in him that had made him say the accounting situation for women in Cincinnati was unjust. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in September, which was not when she had expected it, because she had been expecting it at sunset or in some particular dramatic circumstance. She was in the kitchen making cinnamon rolls, which had become a Sunday tradition, her hands in the dough, and he came into the kitchen at his usual hour for a second cup of coffee and stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment and said, "Caroline." She looked up. "Will you marry me?" he said, just that. Simple and direct and without preamble, the way he said everything that mattered to him. She looked at him for a moment. Her hands were still in the dough. She was in her plainest dress with her hair pinned up in the practical way she kept it for cooking, and she probably had flour on her face. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her for the first time, which she was prepared for in terms of the general category of experience but not in terms of the specific Emmett Donovan quality of it, which was thorough and unhurried and had the same quality as everything else he did of being entirely present in the moment and nowhere else. She had flour on his shirt when he stepped back. She looked at it. "Sorry," she said. "I'm not," he said. He was smiling, the real smile. He poured his coffee and went back to the main room, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her floury hands and the dough and the Sunday morning light coming through the window, and something so settled and warm in her chest that it felt like what the word home had always been trying to describe. They were married in October, in the small church in Redemption with the white paint that had given up in 1868. The Reverend Michaels performed the ceremony with a sincerity that was touching and slightly rushed, as he was due to perform 2 other services that day in neighboring settlements. Mrs. Pierce was there in her best dress and was visibly pleased about the whole business. Agnes Whitfield attended in a buggy she had driven herself and gave them, as a wedding gift, a Hereford bull of notable pedigree that she said she'd been saving for someone who'd know what to do with it. Walt and Lewis and Billy and Morgan were all there, cleaned up to degrees of success that varied considerably. Santos from the livery had come, and the doctor who was also the dentist, and Dawson from the general store who shook Emmett's hand and told him he was a fortunate man, which was the most genuine thing Dawson had ever said in her presence. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, a deep blue that she had chosen because it was practical enough to be useful afterward, and because Emmett had looked at her once when she was wearing her blue working dress with a particular expression that she had catalogued and acted upon. She carried autumn wildflowers, what the territory offered in October, small yellow things and dried grasses that were actually beautiful in the way that honest things tend to be. He held her hand during the ceremony with the same quality of attention he gave everything, as if she were the most important fact in the room, which she supposed she was at that particular moment. When the Reverend Michaels said the appropriate words and Emmett kissed her in front of everyone with a proprietary warmth that made Walt break into a grin, he then tried unsuccessfully to suppress. She thought, "I came west for comfort and found hard work instead, and the hard work was the comfort all along. The wedding supper at the Double D was the best party Redemption had had in years, by general report." She cooked for 2 days beforehand with Agnes Whitfield's housekeeper coming out to help, and Mrs. Pierce contributing 2 apple pies and a quantity of opinions about everything. They pushed the tables in the main room together, and people sat wherever they fit, and the conversation was the rich, overlapping, slightly chaotic kind that only happens when people are genuinely glad to be together. The autumn settled over the valley after that with the particular golden gravity that autumn has in the mountains. the cottonwoods along the creek going pure gold, the mornings cold and brilliant, the afternoons still warm. They were, together, the kind of married couple that neither of them had ever expected to be. Something easy and collaborative and deeply specific, built on the particular architecture of two people who had spent a long time being self-reliant, and had now discovered that being self-reliant with someone else was an entirely different and superior thing. She continued her correspondence with the Cincinnati Female Seminary, which grew through the winter from an informal exchange into something more substantial. By January, she was writing detailed practical guides on Territorial Ranch, accounting that the seminary's business curriculum instructor was incorporating into her course, with full credit to Caroline Donovan, formerly Graves, of the Double D Ranch, New Mexico Territory. Emmett had framed the first letter in which that credit appeared, which she told him was excessive. He hung it in the office anyway, over the desk where the accounts now ran in perfect order. She pretended to be annoyed about this for approximately 2 days before she stopped pretending, because it was genuinely one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in her life. The renegotiation with Fort Union in September of that first autumn had gone the way she had planned, and the new contract for the breeding stock was 22% better than the previous one, which was a number that Emmett cited to Agnes Whitfield, and which Agnes received with the specific satisfaction of someone who had already known the outcome was coming. The winter of 1872 to 1873 was cold but manageable. The ranch was well provisioned, and the house, with Caroline having spent a year making it genuinely lived in, was warm in ways that went beyond the physical. There was the smell of cooking and the smell of good wood fires and the sound of the household having a rhythm, and Emmett Donovan came in from cold day's work and sat at the kitchen table, sometimes just to be in the same room as her while she cooked, not saying much, just present. She had a habit of reading the Santa Fe paper to him at the kitchen table in the evenings, translating the territorial politics and land news and business reports into a kind of running analysis that he listened to with close attention and occasional contributions. He had grown up without the particular luxury of 2 years at a female seminary, his own education interrupted by circumstances he did not choose, and there was a quality in his attention to these readings that was not ignorance but hunger, a continuing intellectual appetite that the West's practical demands had never managed to fully satisfy. She had begun, by February, to teach him the accounting formalism that she had developed in her work with the ledgers, not because he couldn't run figures, but because the structural framework she had built made the analysis faster and more reliable. He took to it with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and within 2 months he was building out new sections of the ledger system independently. "You're going to make yourself superfluous," Walt said to her one morning when she was going over the ledgers with Emmett at the kitchen table. "That would be efficient," she said. "She's already superfluous as a bookkeeper," Emmett said without looking up. "She's been managing the seminary correspondence for months." "I'm not superfluous," she said. "I've diversified." He looked up and smiled at her, and Walt took his coffee and went back outside with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he already knew. In April of 1873, Caroline told Emmett she was pregnant. She told him in the evening in the main room simply because she could not think of any way to say it that was more true than the plain statement. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, something wide open and undisguised that she thought was composed of joy and terror in approximately equal measure, which was exactly what she felt. He crossed the room and sat beside her and took both her hands. "How are you feeling?" he said, which was the most immediately practical question and therefore entirely characteristic. "Well," she said, "slightly tired in the mornings, otherwise well." "Good," he said. He held her hands and looked at them for a moment. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I didn't have a father long enough to learn." "Neither did I for most of the things that matter," she said. "We'll figure it out together. We usually do," He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we usually do." He told the hands at breakfast the next morning with the economy of a man making a work announcement, which it was not, but which was how he handled information that he was too moved by to be elaborate about. Walt shook his hand for a very long time. Louis congratulated him with the genuine warmth of someone who understands that families are made from intention, and that this one had been very carefully intended. Billy said something about needing to fix the loose porch board before a child was running on it, which was unexpectedly practical, and which Emmett immediately agreed with, and they fixed it that afternoon. Morgan said, quietly and with great sincerity, "That's the best news this ranch has had." The summer of 1873 was busy in the way that the ranch always was in summer, and it was also the most physically demanding period of her pregnancy. The heat, and the work of managing a ranch household in the height of the season. But she had become, over more than a year in the territory, genuinely hardy in a way that Cincinnati had never asked of her and that she found she valued. She managed the household. She continued her correspondence. She rode, carefully and over shorter distances, well into July. Agnes Whitfield came over twice in the pregnancy. Once to assess the situation with the general no-nonsense efficiency she applied to everything, and the second time, closer to Caroline's time, with a bundle of advice and practical materials that was so entirely Agnes that Caroline received it with a gratitude that was also slightly amused. "You'll manage," Agnes said the second time with the finality of someone who has decided the matter. "I know," Caroline said. "He'll be useless for the first week," Agnes said with a nod toward the barn where Emmett was visible going through a door with extreme purposefulness. "They always are. Let Walt manage the ranch and let him focus on you." "He won't see it that way," Caroline said. "He'll try to manage everything." "He will," Agnes agreed. "That's why you'll need to tell him clearly what his job is, which is you and the child, nothing else for that first week. Be direct about it. He responds to direct." "I know he does," Caroline said. Agnes looked at her with the evaluating look she gave most things. "You know him very well," she said. "I do," Caroline said. "Good," Agnes said and left. The boy was born on a September morning in 1873, just over a year after Caroline had first ridden into the Double D with a borrowed horse and a cracked trunk and a question about employment. He was born healthy and loud and with a quantity of dark hair that was clearly Emmett's, and the first time Emmett held him, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with the morning light coming through the window she had watched the valley from for over a year, he had an expression on his face that she thought she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. "James," Emmett said, which was the name they had agreed on. James Henry Donovan, after no one in particular, but with a solidness to it that suited the territory. He held his son with a careful competence that suggested he had been thinking about how to do this correctly for several months, which he absolutely had. "Hello, James Henry," she said. Her voice was different than usual, a quality of it she had never heard herself produce before. Emmett looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Exceptional," she said. She was very tired and very happy, and the two states were not in conflict. Walt was told on the porch and received the news by taking his hat off and holding it for a moment in a gesture that was as close as he ever came to the ceremonial. Louis celebrated by riding into redemption and back unnecessarily fast, which was his way. Billy went very quiet in the way of someone who has been moved by something and is not yet sure what to do with it. Morgan said with his characteristic brevity, "A good name." Agnes Whitfield sent a gift of a carved wooden cradle that had been made by a craftsman in Santa Fe, accompanied by a note that said simply, "For the next generation of the Double D." It was the most sentimental thing Agnes had ever produced in writing, and she never acknowledged having sent it. James Henry Donovan grew at the rate that healthy babies in the New Mexico territory grow, which is to say, with a thoroughness and determination that suggested he had inherited his parents' approach to things. He was a solid child with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and a temperament that seemed to combine the best of both his parents in the way that people who are loved into the world by thoughtful people sometimes manage to do. Caroline continued her work with the Cincinnati Correspondence, which had grown into a formal contributing editorship on the newly published Practical Finance supplement of the seminary's quarterly journal. She was informed in a letter of some formality in the spring of 1874, the first contributor from a Western territory, and the first contributor who was also managing a working ranch operation. She read this letter to Emmett at the kitchen table, and he listened with the close attention he always gave things she told him, and when she finished he said, "They should have given you the editorship." "I don't want the editorship," she said. "I want to keep doing what I'm doing." "Then it's perfect," he said. The Fort Union contract had been renegotiated again in the autumn of 1873, with a further improvement of 15% that Emmett handled himself using the analytical framework she had taught him, and the Double D's financial position was by the spring of 1874 the strongest it had ever been. They had added 20 acres to the northeast section by purchasing a parcel that came available when a small holding family moved on toward California, and the spring tracking showed the herd in excellent condition. Billy had turned 19 and was no longer the least efficient person on the ranch by a significant margin. He had become very good with the young horses, and Emmett had raised his wages twice in the past year, which Billy had accepted with the specific pride of someone who understood the statement being made. He had also started courting a girl in redemption, a fact that he was transparent about with everyone except himself, and which the household managed with a diplomatic blindness that was one of their finer collective achievements. The Farrow brothers had not touched the boundary fence since the confrontation in the summer of 1872. Marshall Granger had, at some point in the intervening year, had a conversation with them whose contents were never publicly described, but whose results were visible in the subsequent respectfulness of the Farrows' behavior toward the Double D's boundaries. Agnes Whitfield had resolved whatever the underlying Rafter M management issue was in her own thorough way, and the boundary between the two operations ran clean and agreed upon, and was no longer a source of concern. Mrs. Pierce came out to the Double D for Christmas of 1873 and stayed 3 days, spending most of them in the kitchen with Caroline in a state of industrious sociability that produced enough food to last through January, and a friendship that was, Caroline thought, one of the unexpected and entirely good gifts that the West had delivered. Mrs. Pierce held James Henry with the competence of a woman who had raised children and the pleasure of someone who had finished that particular labor and could now enjoy its results in other people's households. The summer of 1874 was the summer Caroline felt, in the deepest and most settled sense, that she was home. She could not point to a single moment when this happened. It was more like the way the valley's seasons moved, gradual and pervasive, and then suddenly complete. She was sitting on the porch one July evening with James Henry on her lap, the baby heavy and warm and half asleep, watching Emmett come across the yard from the barn in the last of the day's light. He had been working with the young horses, and he was dusty and tired, and he moved with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own body and his own landscape. He saw her on the porch, and his whole face changed, the way it always did, and he came up the steps and sat beside her and put his arm around her and looked out over the valley with the same reverence she had seen on the ridge that first evening. "Good day," she said. "The bay colt is coming along," he said. "He's going to be exceptional." "And everything else is exactly right," he said. She leaned into his shoulder. James Henry made a small sound of protest at the movement and then settled back against her. The mountains were doing their evening work with the light, the extraordinary daily transformation that she had stopped taking for granted and never would. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Redemption 14 months ago with a cracked trunk and a canceled plan and a deep and uncomplicated desire not to go back to where she had come from. She thought about the advertisement and the journey in Gerald Whitmore's kitchen with its missing glass. She thought about Mrs. Pierce's parlor and the argument in the street and Santos's directions and the corral with the young bay colt. She thought about the kitchen and the ledgers and the northeast spring and the ridge at sunset and all of it, every single day of it, the work and the difficulty and the dry heat and the afternoon thunderstorms and the cold mornings and the long evenings in the main room. And she thought, I came here looking for comfort. I found something better than comfort. I found a life that asks something of me and gives something back in equal measure, and a man who sees exactly who I am and chose me with open eyes, and a place that is mine in the way that chosen things are more yours than given things ever manage to be. Emmett, she said. He said. He was looking at the mountains. I'm glad I answered that advertisement, she said. He looked at her and the smile came, the real one. So am I, he said, every single day. She kissed him on the cheek because James Henry was between them and a proper kiss required planning. He turned his face and met her properly anyway, with the same attention he gave everything, thorough and entirely present. James Henry, thoroughly unimpressed, went asleep. Above them, the first stars were beginning in the extraordinary sky of the New Mexico territory, one by one and then all at once, filling it up with their ancient, indifferent, beautiful light. And the Double D Valley held itself quietly in the gathering dark as it had always done and would go on doing, and it belonged to the three of them, and they to it, in the complete and real and hard one way that the best things in a life always do. In the October of 1875, when Caroline told Emmett there was going to be a second child, he was less alarmed and more immediately joyful than he had been the first time, which she noted with satisfaction as evidence of learning. He was also better at concealing the terror, which was still there because he was an honest man and honest men acknowledged the things they were afraid of. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1876 with a quantity of her mother's stubbornness already visible, and a disposition to make her opinions known that was apparent from approximately her first hour in the world. They named her Clara Rose, and Emmett held her with the same careful attention he had given James Henry, but with a quietness that had an additional quality, something softer and more undone than he usually permitted himself to be. James Henry, at 2.5, regarded his sister with the suspicious tolerance of someone who has been told to love something he has not yet decided about and who is still in the process of deciding. He came around within 2 weeks, which was approximately the timeline Caroline had estimated. Walt, at Clara Rose's naming, said this was a complete operation now and went back to his coffee with the satisfaction of a man whose assessment of a situation had been fully confirmed. Morgan said, "Good." Lewis was in the process of becoming engaged to the girl in Redemption, whose name was Juanita, and the joy of his own situation made him effusive about everyone else's, which was a pleasant state of affairs for the household generally. Billy was 20 and beginning to talk about a ranch of his own one day, which Emmett encouraged with the generosity of a man who understood that helping people build toward their own futures was not a loss, but an investment. The letters to Cincinnati continued. The ledgers ran in good order. The Fort Union contract was renewed for the 3rd time, on terms that the fort's procurement officer described as very favorable for the government, which told Caroline that they were actually just and reasonable, which was what she had aimed for. The Hereford bull Agnes Whitfield had given them at their wedding had improved the herd's quality in ways that were showing clearly in the prices they received from the Santa Fe market. The Northeast Spring continued to serve the upper pasture reliably. Agnes Whitfield rode over in the autumn of 1876 to look at the herd and to meet Clara Rose, and she held the baby with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times long ago, and she looked at Caroline over the baby's head with the measuring look that Agnes gave things she had decided about. "You've done good work here," Agnes said. "We've done good work," Caroline said. "All of us." Agnes looked at Emmett, who was visible through the window talking to Walt by the barn. "He was always going to be capable of this," she said. He needed someone capable of the same thing to see it properly. He didn't need me for that, Caroline said. He was doing it fine. He was doing it alone, Agnes said. There was a distinction in the way she said it that was its own complete commentary. Caroline looked at her daughter's face, the round, serious, opinionated face of Clara Rose Donovan, who was presently inspecting Agnes's coat button with the focused academic interest she applied to everything within reach. "Yes," she said, "that's different." It was different. Everything was different from what she had expected when she had packed her trunk in Cincinnati on a gray March morning and told herself she was going west for comfort. Comfort had not been waiting for her at the end of that road. What had been waiting for her was harder than comfort and more sustaining than comfort and more true than anything she had known how to ask for at the time. There was the work of it, the daily, physical, practical, demanding work of a ranch in the New Mexico territory, which never ended and which she had come to love not despite its relentlessness, but because of it, because work that matters is its own kind of conversation with the world. There was the country itself, which still did something to her chest every morning when the light came over the mountains and hit the valley, that she thought would never go ordinary no matter how many mornings she had. There was the household, the specific community of people who worked and ate and argued and celebrated together in the way of all small, close communities, full of personality and opinion and mutual, if sometimes contentious regard. And there was Emmett Donovan, who had said, "I want to be plain with you," and had meant it every single time he said anything, who fixed things quietly without being asked, who listened with his whole attention, who smiled the real smile at her, and only at her with that frequency, who had built something remarkable from nothing and had the grace to call it gratitude rather than pride, who held their children with a careful love that was the same quality as everything else he gave the world. Thorough and real and without performance. On an evening in the autumn of 1876, she was sitting in the main room writing a letter to Cincinnati, and Emmett was reading one of his novels that he had stopped being embarrassed about, and James Henry was asleep in his room after a day of extremely ambitious attempts to participate in ranch work, and Clara Rose was in her cradle making the small sounds of an infant who is working through the important unconscious business of being new. Emmett looked up from his book. "What are you writing?" He said. "I'm writing about water management in arid ranch operations," she said. "For the journal. They've asked me to write something on sustainable water use." He looked at her with that expression she knew so well now, the full, unhurried attention that had felt, that very first time at the corral fence, like being correctly understood. "You wrote a letter to a female seminary from a New Mexico territory ranch," he said, "and now you're writing for their journal." "4 years will do that," she said. "Caroline Donovan, water management expert and ranch accountant." "And cook," she said. "Don't forget the cook." "Never," he said. She looked at him across the warm room, her husband in the lamplight with his book. This man who was so exactly and specifically himself, who she had chosen and been chosen by in the clear-eyed way of people who had done enough living to know the difference between what they wanted and what they needed, and to be fortunate enough to find them in the same place. She put down her letter and went and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her the way he always did, with the ease of long practice and something that went deeper than practice, and she put her head against his shoulder and listened to the valley outside, the creek and the night sounds and the wind in the mountains, and the sounds of her household, her children and her home, and she thought, "This is what I came west for, though I did not know it. This is what was waiting, and it was worth every mile of the road." The lamp burned warm and low. Clara Rose made her small sleeping sounds. Outside, the stars of the New Mexico territory were filling up the sky in their ancient, indifferent way, as they had done before any of them arrived and would go on doing long after. But the valley below was lit with something newer and more deliberate, the light of a house full of people who had chosen to build their lives in that particular place together. And that light was, in its own way, every bit as constant.